had done for them. If the Finns had moved forward and closed the ring of siege around Leningrad, it would have meant the death of the city. Despite the fact that some supplies got through, it was precious little. Starvation drove the population to extreme measures. With the first snows of 1941 came a cruelly bitter winter. The temperature continued to fall, and the German soldiers now paid dearly for the arrogance of the High Command that had refused to admit the possibility of anything other than a quick, decisive campaign. Few men in the German trenches had more than summer clothing, and frostbite took an agonizing toll. German machinery and guns had never been designed to function in such extremes. Engines seized up, metal tank tracks split apart in the cold, ammunition would not fire. The fierceness of the cold was far beyond the experience of most Germans. Emboldened by the problems they saw in the German ranks, a series of Soviet counterattacks managed to roll back many of the German gains around Leningrad. With incredible exertions, the Germans kept up a semblance of defense. The tactics of winter warfare centered around contests for the possession of roads and inhabited places. In Russia, villages and roads were infinitely more important than they were on the rest of the continent. In other German theatres of war, no one particular road ever became a crucial factor, since a well-developed road network always offered a choice of alternate routes. In Russia, the possession of a single road was often a matter of life or death for an entire army. The extreme tactical importance of inhabited places during the 6 months of winter explains the fact that the Russians would frequently much rather destroy them than surrender them to the enemy. In the bitter trench warfare outside Leningrad, the defender had a definite advantage in winter, because, as a rule, their positions could not be seen in the snow, except at very close range. The defenders were able to keep their forces under cover and wait until the moment their fire could be used most effectively. The attacker was also impeded and easily detected, even in camouflage clothing. The principal weapon of the defender became the machine gun, as its performance was not diminished by snow, in which mortars and light artillery lost most of their effectiveness. Replacements were also becoming a problem for the German forces. After the war, it became clear from the diaries of Army Group North that the commanders of both formations had intentionally prohibited, even during calm periods, the removal of a unit from the front in order to grant it a period of rest. It was better to keep the divisions at the front and assign them to a narrower sector, as otherwise a reserve unit which had been removed from the northern front was certain to be taken by the Supreme Command and assigned more pressing pressure points on either the central or the southern front. Although the northern front was regarded as being of secondary importance, it was in no sense a backwater. There was still a great deal of terrible fighting in very difficult terrain, with extensive swamps and few roads through the vast sections of trackless forest, which presented a logistical nightmare. Army Group North and the Army divisions were facing the most difficult conditions on the Eastern Front. The climate and the terrain were completely different. Around Leningrad, it is very marshy and boggy. There were also very few roads, so all transport logistics were very difficult indeed. To To compound the difficulties for the Germans, by October of 1941, the first partisan attacks had begun to cause severe difficulties in the rear areas. The effects of these attacks were further compounded by the fact that the underdeveloped infrastructure of Russia meant that there were very few roads or railways which could be used as alternatives to those blocked by partisan activity. The Russian winter was a nightmare along the whole of the front. But it was Army Group North which bore the brunt of the most extreme Russian winters. It is impossible to exaggerate the cruel realities of fighting in the ferocious winters of northern Russia. In addition to their geographical and climactic difficulties, the fighting spirit of the Red Army facing Army Group North was no less intense than that displayed on the other sectors. The siege of Leningrad has become synonymous with endurance and suffering, but there was also a great deal of intense combat as a series of miniature battles rolled backwards and forwards around the siege lines outside Leningrad. Despite coming very close to victory on a number of occasions, Army Group North was never able to close the ring around Leningrad completely, and the High Command continued to draw desperately needed divisions away from the Army Group North sector in order to feed other hard-pressed sectors. The result of this attrition from two directions was that a ferocious Soviet offensive in January 1944 finally broke the resistance of Army Group North and raised the siege. The lifting of the siege of Leningrad in 1944 forced Army Group North to fall back to a new defensive front, composed of a series of partially constructed defences known as the Panther Line. This line should have represented a fallback position for the German forces, but work was beginning much too late. The Panther Line was envisaged as a series of strong fortifications, incorporating parts of the northern regions of the Soviet Union, in a line running southwards from Lake Ladoga and Lake Pskov, near the town of Narva on the Baltic coast of Estonia. It was envisaged that the German troops retreating behind the line would occupy a series of excellent defensive points. The German troops would therefore have a respite from the rigours of the retreat and be able to hold the Soviet army at bay. Meanwhile, the armoured formations and the air formations of the German army were repaired and returned to the fray to renew combat with their Soviet foes. However, the Panther Line was constructed merely as an afterthought when it was much too late. The German armies had suffered defeats and simply did not have enough troops to man the line effectively. In those areas where adequate defences had been prepared in the line and there were sufficient German troops and aircraft available, it proved a very formidable obstacle for the Soviet army to overcome. Had it been properly prepared as part of a coherent overall strategic plan, the Panther Line could have been held. The Panther Line was only ever going to provide a temporary solution to the mounting problems of Army Group North. The destruction of the neighbouring Army Group Centre in June 1944 tore a huge gap in the German lines and left the right flank of Army Group North vulnerable to a Soviet attack. Hitler was forced to sanction another series of withdrawals. From the Panther Line, Army Group North were forced to retreat in relatively good order towards Germany, fighting a series of ferocious defensive battles as they went. the most notable of these being the defence of Narva in 1944.